I originally heard about Bleak Faith Forsaken back sometime around 2019 at my first job out of uni. At graduate jobs, you tend to get lumped into a room full of people who have been told that they need to teach you an entire career path on very short notice, and they don't always know how to approach that, so I had a lot of spare time. Somewhere, somehow, I stumbled upon the Kickstarter campaign for a game called Bleak Faith Forsaken. Like my unsupervised cat and an open box of packing peanuts, suddenly it was everything I'd ever wanted. Bleak Faith Forsaken looked like Shadow of the Colossus visuals meets Dark Souls combat. The world was ancient and grey and yet somehow alien, like an Aztec filing shrine. Shambling corpses trapped in an undying cycle of death and resurrection had little else to do but fight and go insane. I saw a giant wizened woman with an interesting headdress going ham on a desperately dodge-rolling player character. In a tear-jerking loyal homage to Dark Souls, I noticed that her feet were out. I waited for updates with bated breath. I occasionally checked for news. It's rare for me to be so excited for a game. I never discover games I love until 6 years after they release. For this, I was ready. I was going to be there on day one, pre-ordered. And then out of nowhere, one day I heard that Bleak Faith Forsaken had released on PC already. And not like that day, it was like a month ago. The game had come out and I had not noticed. A game's release has to have been rocky when even people like me, people who were actively waiting on news about said release, don't even notice. If I, the Bleak Faith Forsaken activist that I was, didn't know the game had come out, it was probably not especially well marketed. It didn't help that everyone I showed it to kept reading it as Bleak Faith Foreskin either. You know, that's not going to drive up sales. Still, I waited. I never read any reviews, never looked into any of the lore, I didn't even treat myself to an ending explained lore video to sleep to, because in the year of our Lord 2024, Bleak Faith Forsaken was released on the Xbox One and PlayStation 5, and I managed to beg my way into getting a review copy. And before we dig into first impressions, let me give you my first impressions of Holy, who were kind enough to send over a few samples of their delicious energy drinks for me to try. I've already showcased some Holy drinks over on the other channel I'm so done with, but here we are on the main channel with a genuinely delicious and far healthier alternative to your standard energy drink. My brother struggles with being a full-time energy drink goblin, and I tend to be put off by how unhealthy energy drinks seem to be, so Holy suited us both for different reasons. They sent us a starter kit containing 3 boxes, energy, iced tea, and hydration, and we've already worked through all of them, so I can't even show you them today, but you can check them out over at uk.weareholy.com/merkkk. Now we're cracking on with some fat tubs they sent, and an entire box of my new favourite flavour, pineapple, which is just actually banging. It tastes exactly like pineapple juice, which is like my favourite juice, and it's completely sugar-free. I recommend grabbing one of the starter sets so you get a shaker with it, smooth dibs to the shark, whereas I got this cool little bloke on a bike, and if you don't want to commit to the deluxe starter package, I'd recommend going for either hydration or energy boxes. You can follow the instructions on the side like smooth, or make it like I make it, which is less water, more ice for a more intense flavour. With Holy, you can either buy flavours by the tub or buy boxes containing sachets of multiple flavours, which I personally prefer because I like to mix it up every day and try different things. All the packaging is recyclable and the shakers are adorable and reusable. All Holy drinks are below 20 calories per serving, so I drink mine before I go running. There's no weird crashes or like fuzzy faces either. Again, I highly recommend grabbing a starter kit since they also qualify for free UK shipping. Use the code HOLYKK5 for £5 off any first purchase valued at $14.99 or more, which is ideal for a starter kit, or just HOLYKK for 10% off any purchase. Check out the link in the description or visit uk.weareholy.com/merkkk for more. First impressions weren't ideal. We in the UK are having what we call a heat wave. It was 28 degrees Celsius, which is typically quite manageable, but humidity was at 94%. Having long since liquefied, I booted up a half-hearted stream and we embarked on a journey I had waited literally years to try. Were my expectations a bit high? Yes, that couldn't be helped. That's the point of hype, but keep my extreme bias in mind. Bleak Faith Forsaken is the Souls-like of Souls-likes. That is to say, it takes heavy inspiration from much of the FromSoft series and copy-pastes the rest. Dropping me at the base of an impossibly massive hostile world, the scene was set. I was naught but an insignificant worm trapped at the whim of forces beyond my reckoning, and as a UK resident, that felt a bit too relatable, so this stream didn't last very long. Bleak Faith Forsaken begins with a fairly vague cutscene where you, I assume, fight a fellow Hollow or Plagued or Wizened or whatever Bleak Faith plans to call this new brand of undead, but you, I assume, lose the fight, and then you, I assume, resurrect behind the fight and just kind of carry on with your day, I assume. I don't know, I didn't write it. I've never given much of a shit about graphics, but these are fine, if not good. Even in moments where graphics are a bit broken, you can at least see the vision. I adored the way the player character looks like this strange marionette, some clumsily assembled metal death mask plopped on top of a rough mechanical web of sinew, limbs connected to the torso by bare metal joints like a doctor's practice skeleton. And when you start dressing them up like a Polly Pocket doll, it gets even better, since Bleak Faith Forsaken features a bunch of different armors you can wear either as a single set or with parts from different sets. My mum always said, buy an outfit, not an item, and she seems to have been the Fashion Soul's director on Bleak Faith Forsaken, since all pieces I found did come as full sets, and all full sets looked distinct and very cool. Now, from the bad to the good in this feedback sandwich, Bleak Faith Forsaken has a weak start mechanically, like the second you load in, and this is because of the camera for a few reasons. One, the camera sensitivity is way too high, whipping around at the mildest flick of your thumb on the sticks. Two, the camera is right up your ass, like the smartphone of a rush hour masturbator. And three, the camera points down at the ground over your shoulder. The first two of these problems can be resolved fairly quickly in the settings. The settings are a little jumbled, some stuff is in gameplay, some stuff is in controls, some stuff is in display, and you just have to jump back and forth until you find where things have been allocated. That's fine, even the big studios get this wrong. I yanked the sensitivity down and increased the camera distance, giving myself a nice bit of breathing room. However, the downward point of the camera can't be addressed, which is a shame. There are two standout attributes of Bleak Faith Forsaken: the combat and the environments. We'll cover the combat later, but for now, the environments of this game are absolutely spectacular. The second you load in, you see aqueducts stretching right up into the foggy clouds above, and structures perched precariously on huge jutting rocks that stretch up from the depth below. Winding skinny bridges trail above an impossible abyss, and fumbling architecture grows out of mountainsides like crops of mushrooms. And you don't see any of it because the camera is pointing down. I like to think this is because your character is so moody that they just drag their little metal feet and grumble their way through the game like a teenager on the most lavish holiday of their young lives, but it's little comfort considering it means you miss so much of what makes BFF a very unique game. If you want to stop and look around, you have to hit the brakes on Manny the mannequin and hold back on the sticks to raise the camera up. This is obviously also on the basis that none of the roaming and occasionally respawning enemies jog up behind you and deliver the Caesar treatment, which they are known to do. In more precarious situations, you would never think to stop for a moment and soak up the scenery, so a lot of the game is easy to miss, and it shouldn't be. Now, I know that the camera can't just be pointed up. The ground at your feet is pretty treacherous, and strategically speaking, it is more beneficial for combat and traversal to see the player character and whatever they're fighting from above, more so than seeing distant landmarks. But if I wanted to get a look at what's happening around me, I had to physically stop moving, pull the camera back, and look at the environment. And the environment is one of the best features of this game. Everything visually impressive about Bleak Faith is hidden by a camera that focuses entirely on my character's bald spot. While this is primarily a stop and smell the roses problem, this is also partially because BFF rewards thorough exploration. One thing I found very commendable about Bleak Faith was that if you see a little jutting ledge that looks like it might be climbable, it is. BFF was built by a team of 3 people, and it's a big game, so it's natural to assume that details will be missed, and in some cases they are, but a lot of time and effort has been made to ensure that you never walk out onto a ledge and fall through the textures because there's no collision. Yeah, sometimes you follow a little route and there's not even an item at the end, but that's life. Not every offshooting branch is going to give you a Black Knight halberd. Traversal is a bit rough around the edges, jumping feels weird, like jumping in low gravity, and sometimes you struggle to know where you're allowed to be versus where you should be. In the opening area, the place where you literally touch down and begin the game, there is a huge metal snake thing buried into the structure beneath your feet. It's behind you, so you have to turn around and walk quite a way back towards it to explore it, and I thought that there might be a cool item back here to collect. So I began my exploration of this thing, and I quickly noticed that there are huge gaps in the actual model of the snake. Like when you're out of bounds and you see where all the objects of an area end, like you're only supposed to be seeing the snake from one perspective, and I'm not only going the wrong way, but I'm going out of bounds by walking along it. And I got that weird feeling I get when I remember being shouted at school, and I walked back to the main path. I just don't like getting told off. Who would tell me off for this? I don't know. BFF is truly a modern Rorschach test. To this game's credit, I never fell through a janky or absent collision, but I always felt like I was about to. My next trial was a ladder. Ashamed as I am to say it, with 20-something years of gaming under my belt, but I could not figure out how to get on this thing, and I think that's because of the distracting tooltip that crops up as you approach it. On approach to the ladder, you're told to hold triangle to transition to the opposite side of the ladder, which after a moment of passing I realized meant you hold triangle, the screen turns black, and you'll be at the bottom of the ladder. So I held triangle and I got an error message notifying me that I could not move to the opposite side of the ladder until I had used it at least once. There was no button prompt nor any actual tooltip for climbing down the ladder, although they were added later in a patch. hatch, which I think confused me. I walked against it for a bit to see if my character would automatically climb down, and that didn't work. Pressing X to interact just had my character spring in the air like a fool, and after fucking around a bit too much, I found out. I fell to my death. Bastard ladder. As I later learned, approaching ladders from the bottom does just have your character climb onto it automatically, and while some aspects of gameplay do see tooltips pop up, occasionally with enough text to rival a contraceptive side effects pamphlet, there wasn't a relevant one for the ladder. I wondered briefly if there was supposed to be some unlockable descend ladder skill I would have to pull out of a skill tree, like if Ubisoft bought the rights to Snakes and Ladders. As it turns out, you just need to tap triangle for your character to use a ladder from the top, but I was so unused to triangle being interact that it never occurred to me until I returned on a second attempt. I believe the developers had to patch in a triangle button prompt for ladders, so I am reassured knowing that I clearly wasn't the only one with this dilemma. Holding the triangle button to transition up or down a ladder is a really useful and optional tool for the wily explorer. Somehow it really confused me to learn that before I learned how to use a ladder at all. It would have been better to see that tooltip upon successfully climbing a ladder for the first time. The thing is, there might have been a tutorial for ladders that I missed. Tutorials on Bleak Faith are locked to location, not time. They trigger when you stand in a particular place, and you can walk past them by accident. When you begin the game, you'll come immediately to a three-way intersection. If you were to take the right fork past a pile of destructible boxes, you would trigger the jumping tutorial. If you go any other way, you miss it entirely. Luckily, jumping is tied to the X button, so that one is easy enough to figure out, but I don't know which tutorials I did miss simply by virtue of not standing on the right welcome mat. Tutorials in Bleak Faith are also poorly written, using terms like the B schematic to indicate, I assume, pressing the circle button, which would be B on Xbox? I wasn't sure, but fundamentally the PlayStation controller doesn't have a B button, nor do I have any idea what a B schematic is, so these prompts made no sense. They're clearly developer terms and have no place in a user-facing interface. Users have their own jargon that is far more beneficial for all parties to just use instead. There's no need to reinvent the wheel here. Instead of saying, utilize the B schematic to run or dodge, tutorials should use language like, hold the circle button to jump, tap it to roll. Speaking of transition, much of the tooltips and moments of written exposition are in broken English. I mean, I'm not going to rag on a developer for not speaking English. As someone who only speaks English, I know how hard it is to try and muddle through an encounter in a different language. I hold no snobbery here. I am, however, going to raise an eyebrow if there are minimal efforts made to translate a full-price 30 quid console release. Your more loyal players will persist through this, but it's bad form and it's going to put people off. Someone out there would be happy to help. Hell, I'll do it. Give me a chance, coach. Put me in. Still, my first attempt at Bleak Faith saw me toddle warm and unhappy through some dark rooms and down some dark stairs until suddenly I was smacked hard in the face with a game-pausing, multi-page combat tutorial complete with diagrams. If I wanted to read, I'd have picked up a rag by acclaimed author Stephen King, but I knew how likely it was that I would ruin my time with this game if I skipped this combat tutorial like I normally would a written tutorial, so I sat there with my Twitch chat and we carefully worked our way through it. So the premise of the combat is restraint. Button mashing causes attack damage to drop and stamina to drain faster. A well-timed combo is indicated by wind that swirls around your character and is rewarded with more stamina and a higher attack damage. Blocks and parries, when timed perfectly, also reward you. It was a lot to take in from a single shuffle of tutorial cards, I'll be honest, but I had the basic idea, and with the basic idea in mind, we approached our first enemy. Well, 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 if it isn't dopamine, my old friend. And with that, Bleak Faith Forsaken pulled me in. I'll admit I was initially somewhat disappointed by the game that had previously intrigued me. Yes, I know I only played the first 5 minutes, but I think it's generally a good idea to put your best foot forward in a game that is going for the same miserable uphill climb vibes as the earlier Souls games, especially when it was already demonstrating itself to be a bit of a janky mess of textures and half-baked UX that left me feeling fundamentally in the dark about traversing the area I was literally presently in. Excited by the combat, but fully aware that it was too hot in my UK-grade overly insulated shithole to engage fully with the gameplay of Bleak Faith Forsaken, I bailed. For now. But I would return. I returned to Bleak Faith Forsaken off-stream, since the game decided to be released about 4 days before I was due to fly to Brazil for a month. Running through it was much easier with the heat wave behind me, and without having to keep an eye on Twitch chat that squeaked to me, open-mouthed like a baby bird desperate for mummy's regurgitation, and I was able to make more progress. Now, let's talk about the Dark Souls inspiration. Visually, the starting area of Bleak Faith Forsaken reminds me of kind of like Undeadburg and Firelink Shrine from Dark Souls 1, adorned with crumbling structures built out of chunky grey bricks and coated with patchy grass. It has manta rays flying around in the sky, circa demon souls, shrine of storms, although thankfully a bit less aggressive. There's a man named Abandoned Soldier who meets you fresh out of the starting area and observes, "You're not plagued like the others, are you?" Basically just ripping the concept of hollowing straight from the Souls series, and he has the gall to end his speech with a little laugh like all the NPCs do. In that classic way of subtle Souls direction, he even says, "I wouldn't challenge that brute down there, but when I cast an eye out across the area his little stone chair was perched by, there was nothing except for basic enemies. There was no brute to be seen." Maybe there was at one point in development, but the enemy was moved and the dialogue had already been recorded. Or maybe he was referring to something not immediately evident to me. Or maybe the Abandoned Soldier had been himself moved and his dialogue wasn't relevant anymore. Put a pin in this. From here, I did what I came to do. I went exploring. While BFF clearly takes inspiration from Dark Souls, it inadvertently reminds me of a different game that I love, Chronos Before the Ashes. Any Chronos fans here today? There are dozens of us. Dozens. Chronos Before the Ashes was a charmingly slow and janky game released in 2016 with a surprisingly fleshed out combat system that felt so rewarding to learn. I loved Chronos. Bleak Faith Forsaken felt the same. As in Chronos, there's clearly been so much time and effort employed in crafting a fundamentally fun backbone of a combat system that in some ways exceeds some of the mechanics of Dark Souls that the game clearly copied, demonstrating a genuine and successful effort to build upon its own inspiration. Perfect parries have this shock of orange light, and the enemies you parry recoil so theatrically that it feels great to nail them. You don't get a ludicrously long time to hit them either. Attack windows are a reasonable length. It's not like you get one stun in and then just wipe the floor. Some enemies stagger far too easily though, even with the starting weapon. Many of the first area enemies cannot get a hit off because any old bonk will send them sprawling, so you could tune their poise up a bit higher. Blocking is effective, although Bleak Faith's lack of feedback makes it confusing to understand if you're blocking anything at all. You'll hold block and there's no controller vibration or screen shift when you get hit. The only indication is that a chunk of stamina will go, and it's not always easy to keep an eye on that when you're fighting. Blocking consumes stamina, and if you don't have enough stamina, you take the leftover in damage, which is par for the course in Souls-likes and works as expected. Bleak Faith also contains the Souls classic Estus flasks, except they recharge between combat, which I loved. In theory, they're finite, being items that you collect and are automatically replenished when a combat encounter ends, but I think that you'd have to go well out of your way to ever run dry of heals in Bleak Faith Forsaken. And call me a heretic if you want, but I love the concept of rechargeable Estus. I think that it is such an intuitive way of allowing you to spend ages combing the world without having to run back to arbitrarily recharge your health, but also maintains challenge during boss fights where you have the same resources as you would when fighting a basic enemy. Exploration is easier, but combat is just as difficult, which I think really suits the Souls-like genre, especially since the bonfire equivalent of Bleak Faith Foreskin, some bandaged dudes who twitch their heads Silent Hill style, are ludicrously few and far between. The game also has a scan mechanic, which was a surprise considering the dark fantasy setting. It felt quite sci-fi. This mechanic allows you to scan areas by holding triangle to raise the menu and pressing up, which activates a little orb thing that scans the immediate environment. This is two-pronged. You can spot items and bits of lore during this that would otherwise be invisible, but the scan is so bright that the environment goes black and enemies aren't highlighted on the scan, so you have the risk and reward of the threat of ambush. Still, I think the scan is so important that it should have its own dedicated button rather than relying on held triangle button press combo. Similar to Returnal, which uses the R3 stick to scan, Bleak Faith would do well to prioritize its core mechanics to actual buttons rather than trying so hard to emulate the Souls control scheme, which it copies exactly. Bleak Faith Forsaken also tries to emulate the way Souls games approach shortcuts by having kickable ladders across the landscape that theoretically cut journeys in half. Sorry to say, most of these I found to be useless. For example, there's one route that takes you on a big semicircle loop around the main area, and one ladder that cuts a big chunk out of that semicircle loop. But there's no reason ever to return here, and either end of this route can be approached individually. I never experienced a situation where a shortcut helped me traverse an area, but rather it just became a way to mentally tick an area as complete. What's more, this game is a bit too dark, scan or not, and when I went to boost my gamma, I discovered something that surprised me. The grim, dark, miserable dungeon I was in suddenly illuminated into an ethereal blue, cold slabbed room. It raised the brightness and the saturation very considerably. The world looked so much more vibrant, like there's this gorgeous hidden color palette hidden under the grimy surface. Gamma, I think, should be higher by default. The game looks better with a bit of light on it. And so I wandered, soaking up the visuals and loving the combat. While a little rough around the edges, this is a brilliantly crafted experience by, and I reiterate again, 3 people. 3 developers made this behemoth of a game. However, can you guess where my journey came to an end? So, taking the conversation back a few pegs, the assumed brute mentioned by the abandoned soldier may have been the mutated ghoul, my first and last boss encounter of this game before I uninstalled it. What, you say uninstalled it? Yeah, I did. I had no trophies, so I had nothing to lose, and I can't overstate this enough, this boss fight was an enormous red flag. It was such a red flag that I just kind of left the game then and there. I mentioned before that the combat of Bleak Faith Forsaken is really good, and it is. By the time I reached the mutated ghoul, I had a cool rusty claymore and a full set of hunter's armor. I looked so good and felt like I was properly getting the hang of the game. The problem? The boss fight absolutely disregards the combat, like it's been produced with a different game in mind. If this is the brute the abandoned soldier is suggesting you avoid, then you're probably supposed to leave it be, and if I'd have walked in and been like one shot, I probably would have left it alone. However, the mutated ghoul doesn't have too much health and it doesn't do too much damage. I almost killed it a few times, so I'm fairly confident, but the issue lies in the fact that it's completely unpolished. Firstly, if you get the right RNG on its moves, you can just slot yourself into its thigh gap and smack away at its legs completely undeterred. The mutated ghoul's only recourse is to jump backwards. This plays havoc with the lock-on camera. It will fly over your head and the camera goes nuts. So I tried varying it up by unlocking the camera, relocking it, etc., which solved about 30% of the problems, but still had me thoroughly confused and wondering what I was looking at half the time. It's not a very reactive enemy with only a few individual animations, making the fight feel janky and stiff, but it is very fast, which is at odds with the generally slow and lumbering combat system of Bleak Faith so far. What turned me off it, however, was its AoE moves. The mutated ghoul can summon rocks to come bursting out of the ground, either around it in a wide circle or ahead of it in branching prongs. The wind-up is very small, there's so little indication that it's happening that it's frustrating to deal with. I felt like he would smash the floor and rocks would burst from the ground in absolute silence. There's no camera shake, ground shake, no haptic feedback in the controllers, the rocks burst out immediately, there's no noise sting, you probably have only a second to dodge, and the rocks also have no collision, so you can roll straight into them, literally inside them, and take full damage. You can block, but the damage is typically quite high, and I don't think you can jump over them either, since they're so tall that they take up the entire screen. There are a couple different kinds of rock moves he can do. He can do rocks in a big circle, he can fire them out in multiple directions, he can do them in one long line that spreads out in front of and behind him, and he can do a localized one in a semicircle around him if you're too close. None of these felt like they had individual animations. I just had to guess what he was going to do based on distance. This would really work, considering the rocks burst out of the ground so fast that you have no time to respond, and the camera was buck wild up his arse, pointing random ways. I never really knew what the fuck was going on. I would just try and roll away. If I was lucky enough to roll away from the straight line one, then wonderful. If I rolled but he was casting the multiple direction one, I would roll into the next row of rocks and I would take half a health bar of damage. I tried against this boss a couple of times, almost killing it a few times, and it didn't feel cheap or broken or unfair, but it felt unpolished. The animations were so clunky and the attacks felt so poorly implemented that I took a moment to consider whether I was going to have to deal with worse shit down the line. Considering this is potentially the first boss you fight, and probably therefore the boss with the most time and effort put into it, I decided to cut my losses here and I uninstalled the game before you could say get good. Despite my friction with Bleak Faith, I don't think I would write it off. After a break, I think I'll come back to it myself. I think the most important part of a game is the foundation, and what Bleak Faith has is a really solid skeleton of combat and some competent world design. It's just the surface level that struggles, the polish. Consequently, if that combat backbone vibes with you, I totally recommend this game. I think there's a lot here that a specific player would unquestionably love. I've seen some people refer to it as a contender for Game of the Year, and I respect all opinions, even weird ones. But still, there is something under the surface that is completely along that vein. Considering this game was made by only 3 people, there is clearly oceans of talent on this team, and this is their first pass at making a final product that I could see. Like how the first Pancake is always kind of a write-off for forces outside our control, Bleak Faith Forsaken has all the ingredients of a good experience, but is definitely one I would lump on my brother's plate instead. I think the devs of Bleak Faith Forsaken probably bit off a bit more than they could chew. Rather than creating a very tight, short, and more well-rounded experience, it seems to me that they tried to stretch out and create a massive, disparate world full of nooks and crannies to explore. Unfortunately, I just don't think that was possible with the resources they had, and it was clearly even harder to perfect. Still, I say this without a hint of sarcasm. I am excited to see what they do next with the feedback taken off the back of Bleak Faith Forsaken. There is so much promise here. Most importantly, however, don't call your game something people will easily misread as foreskin. It's bad for business.